Hey everyone, Arbiter617 here from Black Plaza Studios, bringing you episode 3 of our Minecraft animation tutorial series using Blender. In this episode, we'll be showing you how to render the scene, we'll talk about ambient occlusion, adding lights, adjusting the materials on object lights as well as advanced materials for vegetation. We'll be talking a little bit about compositing, and at the end, I'll be showing you some of our previous animations and we'll be looking at how the light was set up in those animations. Two quick things before we begin. First, I'd like to talk about the autosave feature. If you ever have your Blender crash and you thought you lost some work, if we just open Blender back up, we're back in just the default scene. If we go to File, Recover Autosave, there should always be a bunch of autosaves. It should be ordered actually by date, so you'll usually just want to go to whatever the top one was. Here just a moment ago, I quit out of the carrot scene, so if I open up this quit.blend, it'll bring us right back to the carrot scene, and you can just file, save right over it. And secondly, I remembered another one of the shortcuts that I had changed, that I actually forgot about it because it's been a while since I've changed it and I just got so used to not having it. If we go to File, User Preferences, we go into our input. If we type in hide, and then we look under, scroll down a little bit, under Object Mode, right here where it says H to set restrict view, let's just X out of that. Basically, and then hit Save User Settings. Basically, let's say we have this hay bale and we want to press G to move it. When we press G, we're moving around. But you accidentally press the letter right next to G, which is H. If you pressed H, it would actually hide the object, which isn't what we want to do. And I would find that a lot of times when I was starting Blender, I'd actually press the H key instead, and I'd just be hiding all these things and having to undo constantly. So changing that would fix that problem. So let's get started, and I'll show you how to render the scene. So far, we've just been looking around the viewport. Obviously, the animation is not going to look as plain and simple as this. We're not going to see all these little lines. We're going to get a lot more lighting in it. So if I press F12, you'll notice it will start rendering the scene. And luckily we've already set up all the render settings in episode 1, I believe. So all of our sampling should be set, all of our light paths should be optimized, we have our GPU going, so it should render decently fast. I actually set the sampling to fairly low in order to allow it to render faster. Before the end we will actually increase that number, but you should get something like this. And what you'll notice is it's always going to render based on where your camera is, such that, if I'm here and I'm like, okay, let's see what he looks like, and then you press F12, it'll still keep rendering from the camera, which is way over here. So what I like to do is, of course, when rendering, go into the camera and position your camera somewhere where you get a pretty good view of some different things. So let's get something maybe like down here, get a good view. That should be a pretty decent view for what we're going to do. So I'm just going to park the camera here. Now we have a nice view, and we're going to be using this to do some rendering. So again, let me press F12. And here's the finished render. And every time we press F12, it changes the scene to this different view. And if I just press Escape, I can get back out of it, back to our normal view. If we want to look back at our previous render without rendering again, we can simply press F11. That'll bring it back to the thing. If we middle mouse click and drag, we can look around on it. If we zoom, we can scroll, we can look closer at it. And every time you press F11, you can hit escape to go right back, F11 to bring it up. Every time you render, it will render into the slot which is set. Currently we're set to render in slot 1. So let's actually change this to slot 2. And we have nothing rendered into slot 2 because we haven't hit F12 while in slot 2. Let's hit escape. Let's move the camera, maybe to something over here. Get like a close-up view of him like I was talking about earlier. Now we'll hit F12. And now that we're rendering into slot 2, this gives us the ability to now look between slot 1, we'll have the old render, and slot 2, have a new render. If we go into slot 3, we can move the camera and hit F12 again. And basically, the reason I wanted to talk about this right up front is this is probably one of the most useful things, figuring out the whole F11, F12, and these slots. Everything about lighting is going to be about comparing renders, comparing render times. What you normally do is you set up the camera like I had initially, you find a good position, you go, okay, that's good, and what we'll be doing, we'll go to slot 1, we'll hit F12, and we're going to continuously adjust the lighting and render into new slots, and we'll keep comparing with the previous, and as long as the new version is consistently better than the previous, you'll be continuously improving your lighting. The other thing to note is the time. In the upper left, it'll tell you the time it took to render. So it took 5 seconds and 25 milliseconds, I guess, for that to render. And we'll also be comparing render times. I'm actually going to increase my sampling a little bit just because it's rendering pretty quickly and I'd like it to look a little bit better. You may want to leave yours at 20, or even if it's going a little slow, you can cut yours down to 15 or 10. And finally, the other option is if you want to actually look at the scene rendered without rendering, you can actually go down here to where we change it to material, and you can change this to rendered view and get a sense of what the lighting will look like in real time. You can adjust the lamps, you can move around. I normally don't use this anymore. This is something I kind of used to use a few times way back. To me, it just seems a little slow and kind of hard to see. Anyway, let's talk about the first thing in setting up the light. If I go back to F11 and we look at things, okay, we got our sky, we have a little bit of light, we can see it's kind of, lit. However, it's very dark. So the first thing I will do, let's go into slot 2. We're going to add the first step in lighting. We'll just overwrite that little thing I was testing. And we're going to go to the world settings. We're going to turn on ambient occlusion. So let's leave ambient occlusion to where it is and hit F12. And let's just see what that did. So right away you can already see the difference. We already have a pretty decently lit scene. If we compare between slot 1 and slot 2, we can see there's a lot more light in the scene. However, adding ambient occlusion, it just kind of throws light all over into the scene. It's not really enough to light the scene. We actually want some sunlight. So what I like to do is turn the ambient occlusion down a bit. So let's go into slot 3. I usually leave it around 0.4. Sometimes I go way lower if you want a really dark scene. Let's try 0.4 and look at it. So here's 0.4. If we go back to here, it was the default of 1. As you can see, 0.4 is a little darker, but it's not nearly as dark. It's only had at 0. And don't worry about it being a little dark at 0.4. We'll be adding some light in a moment that'll kind of counteract it. However, we don't want light just all over the scene. We're going to be adding actual sunlight. And the other thing to notice is this distance. And this is something that I don't fully understand where they're getting the distance from. All I really know is that the higher this number is, the more darks you're going to have in tight spaces, and the lower number it is, the brighter interiors will be. For example, if I go to slot 4, turn the distance down to something like 4, and render it again. The difference on the interior is where it's most noted. If we go between slot 3, we can see the interiors were very, very dark. Under the trees were pretty dark. But then lowering that distance from 10 to 4, illuminated a little bit of the undersides and the insides. It may be a little bit less realistic. However, I find that it reduces a lot of the noise on the inside. So now that we have something we like, I'm going to render that 0.4 with a distance of 4. I'm going to render that into slot 2. And then we will continue from slot 3 with our next settings. So the next thing to do is, if you're doing an outdoor scene, probably be to add a sunlight. If you're doing an indoor scene, it might be a little different. We'll kind of be talking about that later at the end of the episode when I'm showing you some different scenes. But assuming you're doing an outdoor scene, what you'll do is create a sunlight by doing Shift A, go to lamp, and add a sunlight. And again, it's somewhere down below the world. If we just click here, Shift S, selection to cursor, bring it up. We pull it up a little bit. We'll see we created this weird little, it's kind of hard to see, honestly. It's a little dotted line, some kind of this thing here. But if we press R to rotate it, we'll see it points that little dotted line in different places. That's basically saying we want the sun to shine, in that dotted line's direction. So because we have the sun over there, we should probably line it up a little bit. But honestly, I've actually had plenty of animations where the sunlight is actually shining the opposite direction as the actual sun. People usually don't seem to really notice or care. Another thing to consider is where our shadows are going to be. For instance, if I put the sun like this, the house is actually going to cast a shadow over all the carrots. I don't know if I really want that. So I'm actually considering changing. I think I'm actually doing it from over here would be best. However, now we might want to rotate the world. So let's maybe rotate the sun such that the sun's coming roughly from the same direction. So we're going to get a different sky when we re-render, but that's fine. So the first thing you'll notice is there's a little bit more light kind of coming in from this side. If we switch between slot 2 and slot 3, all we changed was we rotated the sky and we added the sunlight. We can really see the trees are starting to have a little more shine on them, the front of the roof's having a little more shine, but it's really hard to kind of see the punchiness of the shadows. So if we go to slot 4, what I'm going to do is, if we have the sun selected, we can go over here to the sun settings and we can change some different values. Now what I'm going to do is, first, let's click on the color. Let's give it just a little bit of an orange, just yellow. And let's increase the brightness to something like 3. And let's render again. So now we just rendered into slot 4. And as we can see, now we're really starting to get a lot more effect on that sunlight. Before it was kind of flat. By bringing it up to 3, we really clearly see a shadow coming in. The face looks a little illuminated. We actually have some sunlight. We can see the shadows here. And here was just pure ambient occlusion, and here was nothing at all. So as you can see, we've come a long way just from setting up these few things so far. And the last thing I'd like to talk about with the sunlight is the size. Let's go into slot 5. I'm going to bring the size down to 0. We're going to render it again. And basically what that's going to do is, the smaller the size, the sharper the shadows. At size of 0, it's going to have completely sharp shadows, and the bigger size just keeps getting softer and softer. So for example, if we look at the shadow on the fence, with the size of 0, we see the perfect, straight line, but at a size of 0.1, it gets a little kind of feathered and blurry in the distance. So now that we have that nice, I'm going to render that into slot, let's see, we have ambient occlusion, then number 3 is where we added the sun. So let's take the first one that has the sun, put it in slot 3. You don't have to be following along with all these savings of slots and stuff, by the way. This is just kind of for me to keep you guys, informed on how the progression of the lighting has gone. The next thing I'd like to talk about is using objects as lights, and what I'm going to do here is going to be a little bit of a detraction. What I want to do is start testing the indoor lighting scene. However, I don't want to move this camera. Yeah, I know there's ways to make multiple cameras. Don't worry about it. What I'm going to actually do is just a little trick here. You can kind of just ignore this. I'm going to animate the camera such that we get a different shot from in here. That way I can switch back in a moment when I want to go back to the outdoors. This is just quicker for me, honestly. Then you'll see we have some decent kind of room. However, one thing you'll notice is these glowstone lights that we created really don't seem to be creating much light. So that's what the next part's going to be on, is using objects as lights. So far we created this sunlight, which did a good job lighting the outside, but these indoor objects aren't creating much light. So if I right click them and we go into their materials, we'll see all these little options. If we just kind of expand all these little things around here, expand oh man, there's a bunch of stuff. Let's actually not expand that, never mind. Let's go to split the screen. We should probably just go into the node editor, because that's where we're going to be ending up anyway, so I should just start with that. Let's split the screen, change the left side to nodes. Also a little trick, because I use the node editor a lot, you might be as well. If you click on this when it brings up the settings, if you press N for node editor, it'll jump straight to the node editor. So you don't have to, every time I bring it up, I'm always looking around for it, so I usually just press N. Anyway, let's go to the object nodes. And here are the nodes for the glowstone. And right here, we see an emission, as in the ability to make it glow. Let's crank this up to something like, oh, we want it to be brighter. Let's make it, 4 times as bright. Let's go all the way up to strength 10. And we'll render strength 10 into slot 7. And we'll see, oh, cool. The interior is a lot brighter now. That looks kind of nice. However, the glowstone went crazy by increasing the strength. Here's before, dark, but the glowstone looks nice. Here's after. The interior is looking nicer, however the glowstone looks terrible. So there's actually a trick to correcting this. If we want to increase the brightness without increasing the look of the object, let's go into the settings of it. The way the glowstone's set up, I'm honestly not even really sure I even liking this. So what I'm actually going to do, let's actually hit B. We're going to box select everything, just get rid of all of this. We're going to create it back ourselves. There's a lot of stuff that wasn't being used, so let's just build it back ourselves. Let's go back to search. We're going to add an emission, and we're going to have the image go into the emission and right back into the surface. And let's just again, let's render that into slot 8 just to show you that it's, right now we're going to get just the default glowstone. So there's a glowstone, how it is, by default. And if I go to slot 7, let's increase the strength maybe back to where they had it about, 2.2 or something. So now that we have this whole scene, simplified, we cut out all those nodes we didn't need. Let's show you the trick I was going to show you on how to make it brighter. Let's go to slot 6 just to make sure we don't accidentally overwrite those. What we're going to want is to search by Shift A. We're going to search for a mix shader. Again, sorry I did that a little fast. I'm in such a habit of just doing these normally. If you do Shift A, brings up this, you hit search, you type mix, click on mix shader, and if you drag and drop the mix shader onto a little node curve, it automatically connects them. If you drop it next to it, what you'll have to do is just connect the nodes to it. Oops, or do that, just drag it on it. If you ever want to cut one of these nodes, if you hold Control, click and drag over them, it'll cut the node. So we want the emission to go into the bottom of the mix shader. mix shader to go into the surface, and we're going to connect some more things into these other slots. So let's add another emission, and we can do that by simply duplicating this one. If we click on it and go to Shift D, we'll duplicate it. We're going to bring in the color as well, put the emission into the top slider. This time, we're going to use the top emission for the glowing into the scene. Let's change that to like 15, and the bottom emission into what we see. But rather than using the factor, we're going to add one more node. That's called the light path node. Put up here. We want the is camera ray to go into the factor. And now let's render it into slot 6. And now you see we've achieved the best of both worlds. We have created the brightness we want in this scene. Here is it before. Didn't really seem to be lighting up much. If you go into slot 6, it really illuminates the scene. However, it's not going crazy, making the lightstone go exploding. One thing you'll note is there's a lot of noise, and that's one thing I've noticed just from using objects as lights. The brighter it seems like you make these objects, if you brought this up to like 20, the more noise you're going to get. Lighting indoor scenes is pretty tough, especially with Blender's cycles. However, it's not always going to look this bad. We're only doing 40 samples right now. If I render this again into slot 5... Oh, wait a second. Let me make sure I can. Yeah, slot 5 something we can write over, because that was just a test earlier. In slot 5, if I increase these samples, we have it at 40. I'm going to crank it up to 200 real quick, and just show you that by having more samples, we can get rid of some of that noise. And there we go. As you see, by increasing the samples, now all that noise went away. So you don't really have to worry about it being a problem. We have the glowstone kind of decent, but it's also glowing, illuminating the interior very nicely. There's still a little bit of noise. And again, you know, if you had the time, 21 seconds per frame is still not long at all. I could triple the samples and it'd only be taking a minute per frame, and we could probably make it look even cleaner. But it certainly looks a lot better than... Oh, wait. Oh, here's the noisy version, and there's the cleaned version, just with more samples. Anyway, let's go back to the slot 4 was where we left off. Again, let's revise. We went from slot 1, we had no light in the scene at all. Slot 2, we added some ambient occlusion. We changed the factor and the distance. Slot 3, we added a sunlight, which we decreased the size and increased the brightness. Slot 4 was nothing yet, it was just a test. So slot 4 is we're going to pick up, and we've kind of covered most of the things on some of the default lights right now. As I get to the end of the episode and I start looking at the other animations, I'll be showing you a lot of the other lights. We haven't talked about, if we hit Shift A, we can add point lights. These are actually very common lights. However, for this scene we don't really need them, so we won't really be looking at them as far as making them. But anyway, let's start talking about materials now, and I'll be showing you another trick that I kind of missed out on the last tutorial series back in 2015. However, it's pretty handy as far as making these leaves look a little better. One thing you'll notice in Minecraft is, if I look at this leaf here, in Minecraft you only actually see this leaf face. You don't see through it and see that one kind of on the far top. In other words, you don't see a face which is looking away from you. So I was wondering if there's any way to recreate that in Blender, and sure enough there is. Let me go back to the beginning of the animation when the camera's outside so we can get our shot back. Let's split the screen. Go into the node editor, we can just hit N. And we hit N to make that go away. Let's go to our object nodes. And here we have the leaf nodes. And again, just like on the glowstone, we don't want them to be glossy. So let's just get rid of that, and didn't change anything. But what we're going to want to add is Shift A. We're going to hit Mix, and we're going to drop it right here before the end. And we're going to want to mix all of everything with the transparent. Put that in the bottom. And what we're going to want to do is add geometry to the top. And we're going to go into the back facing, into the factor, and basically what that has now done is exactly what we wanted. If we get close, we can already see it's working in the viewport. We no longer see that face in the back, or pretty much anything on the back sides of the leaves, which is how leaves actually work in Minecraft. So if we render it out now, I'm actually going to close this node editor. Actually, I'll just pull the node editor to the side. We won't be using it again. Let's render it out in slot 4, and see how it looks. So here's our back facing off on the leaves, and here is before, back when it was very dense and dark. they look kind of nasty. Having that ignore back facing just kind of lightens up your forest a little bit, brings in more light. However, one thing to note is it did increase the render time from 8 seconds all the way to 9.5 seconds, which means when rendering an animation, that could be the difference of, a day to a day and 2 or 3 hours or something. So it is a big difference kind of in the end, but I think it's worth it for a lot of scenes. Looks nice. And the next thing I want to show you is another trick I do on another materials I do on kind of vegetation, and that is called translucency. So we can do it on both the leaves and the grass. Let's do those kind of both at once. Also, you may even want to do them on the flowers and stuff, but let's start with the leaves. So way over here in the diffuse is what's causing it to just, have the light hit it and just stop. We're gonna, right after the diffuse, we're gonna do Shift A and add an add shader. Put it right here. And we're gonna Shift A, search for translucent. And we're gonna add the translucent into it, which is gonna get crazy for a second, but then we need to just make sure to hook the color up. And it'll look about the same, although it'll look a little brighter in the viewport. Let's do the same thing on the grass. Pull the image over, pull the diffuse over, add an add shader, add a translucent, and connect the color up. And let's make sure we're rendering to the right slot. And there you go. It's not really a big difference in this scene because there's already a lot of light in the scene, but if we compare back to slot 4, we can see that it kind of brightens up the areas where light hits it a little more. Because this scene wasn't the best example, I actually quickly pulled up a picture I did a little while ago. This was an old render I did when I was first testing translucency on the vegetation. So here is just a default scene kind of in the meadow. I have the sun very bright in this scene and very low to the ground. And as we can see, the sun was actually kind of over here shining towards us. And as we can see, the grass away from us, to the right is very bright. But as we look towards the sun, everything is very dark. If I switch to this one, I added translucency, and you can see the sun shining through the leaves here and through the grass. Really kind of illuminates them. It looks a lot more like what you'll see in shaders. So the translucency is useful, but another thing to notice is it brought the render time further up from 9 seconds all the way up to, from 9 seconds all the way up to 12 seconds. So the translucency will be somewhat of a render slowdown. If you have just a default daytime scene, you might not really need it, but if you want something a little more moody, which we'll be kind of looking at a little bit later, you may really want to have that light kind of shining into them. While I was rendering, I just remembered I actually have a few other examples of where I was learning about translucency. Here's the survival game scene just with default lighting, and here's a bunch of other effects I added on. Some things are missed and stuff we'll be looking at later. I'm looking at glow. However, where you can really see the translucency is somewhere like here, where you have a kind of dark and atmospheric scene. However, you have a really bright light, and you can see it kind of shines through these leaves and the grass that are visible, but whenever there's like the grass in the shade, it turns dark. Anyway, that about covers the kind of lighting and material stuff. Let's start looking at some of the compositing. What I actually just showed you in one of those renders was the mist, and I'll show you how to set up the mist. If we go to render layers, and we go to passes, we can turn on a mist pass. And this isn't something you necessarily need. I know in the last tutorial I showed people how to use mist, and then suddenly I saw everybody using mist. And you don't really need mist. Honestly, if you had a clear day like this, realistically, you might not need mist. I just find it's nice to sometimes add a little bit of kind of mist. It just makes things a little more atmospheric. But anyway, so we added the mist. The first thing I want to do is go to the world settings, and we'll see we've created a new section here called Mist Pass. Here we have the start and basically the start and the end of where we want the mist to be. And I wouldn't go to 25 blocks because that means the mist is going to end like right after the house. I would go to something like, let's change that to like 64 or something. And in slot 6 now, we're going to render with mist. And what you'll notice is nothing actually changed because simply turning on the mist doesn't actually do anything. What we have to do is go into compositing, which is why I mentioned we'll be looking a little bit at compositing. And I wanted to kind of bring compositing into the lighting episode, whereas last series I had the compositing a completely different episode. Here, I usually work with compositing and lighting side by side because a lot of your lighting is going to come through in the compositing, so it's good to just kind of do them together. So first let's rearrange this a little bit. Let's go down here, press 0. That was a kind of loud smack of the 0 key. Let's go to material so we can see it. So let me bring the, we're going to bring this window down a little bit. We're going to click use nodes. I'm going to click backdrop. And so far we don't see anything. But what we want to do is we want to create a viewer node. If we hold Control, Shift, and left click on render layers, it will create a viewer node and we'll see our backdrop. If you're rendering in 1080p, or if you're doing 720p and you're on a small laptop, over here on the right, if we press N to bring up the right side, if we go to the zoom, we can zoom in and out of the back. I think there's actually, there might be a shortcut to zoom, I don't know it though. But anyway, so we have our thing in the background, and you'll notice we have a mist thing. And what we can do is if we do Shift A, we add a mix node. We're going to put it between the render layers and the composite, and we're going to mix the image with the mist, and you will see nothing changes. We have the mist in the factor, and then the image into the image. We have just white color in the bottom. Nothing changed. That's because we still have our viewer node set to the render layers. If we Control, Shift, and left click on mix, we'll move it over to the mix, and boom, we have some mist. And what's cool is you can pick this color and you can change it around. We can make a little bit of kind of blue mist. Maybe just a little bit of that. And this is what I'm talking about by mist. It really just makes a nice kind of effect. However, you're probably not going to want it so dense because it already got completely rid of all the sky. So between the mist and the mix factor, we're going to Shift A, we're going to add a map value. If we put that right on that curve, what we can now do is we can decrease the size, and we'll start getting the sky back. And we just have a little bit of mist kind of in the distance. And what's nice is using the Control, Shift, left click, we can compare original without any mist to having a little bit of mist. It doesn't ruin the sky too much, but it really adds a lot of, kind of the feeling of depth to the distance. So that's the mist. The final thing I'll be looking at in compositing, and before we move on to looking at some of our other BPS scenes, is the kind of glow, or as we call it here at BPS, the boosh. And before I actually get into that, let me import like a piece of glowstone here or something. This isn't something you need to know, however, we're going to have a hard time showing glow when there's nothing really in the viewport to glow. So just give me a quick second while I bring something in. Okay, I made a little lamp, just a very simple one, just so we can test the glowing a little better. So let's make sure we're in the right slot. So inside our compositor, we have our mix for our mist. And in the old tutorial series, the way I showed how to make glow was to, I believe I showed you I think it's called glare. If we add the glare node between the mix and the composite, we shift left click on it so we can see it. We'll see it automatically did something over here. However, you really don't have much control over that. Honestly, the glare wasn't something I actually really used. What I do is kind of custom glow, or boosh, and I'll show you why we call it boosh in a little bit, so the way I set up the custom glowing is as follows. Let's move all these things way over to the left. First thing we're going to need, Shift A, we're going to add a color correction. Just kind of put it up here, it's a pretty big node. Shift A, and right next to it we're going to add a blur, and put it right here. And then finally we're going to create a mix, and then the mix we're going to put between this mix and the composite mix. And if I Control Shift click on mix, we just get some weird thing because we're not done with it. But let's Control Shift click on the where the mist was. Let's bring that into the color corrector. So now it's actually going into the color corrector as well as the top of the next mix. Let's Control Shift click on the color corrector. Now we can see what this sees. So what we're going to want to do is bring the gamma down to something like 0.7 or 0.75 maybe. And then I usually bring the midtones down to like 0.8 and the shadows down to maybe 0.1. So what we've done, we've isolated just the bright parts of the scene, and what we're going to do now is blur that. So let's put the blur, let's just connect the image into the blur. Let's Control Shift click on the blur now, and we haven't added any blur yet. So let's maybe give it something like maybe 15 and 15. So now we've kind of given it some, maybe a little more, it's 20 and 20. So now we've blurred it, and we're going to want to bring this blur into the mix node, into the bottom. Just Control-Shift-Click it. But rather than simply, mixing between the two, getting some kind of nasty thing, we're going to change the mix to add. So now we're adding the glow onto it, as you can see. So here's, default, and here's with some boosh. And you can go back into this color corrector if you don't want the sky so bright. Let's maybe bring the sky down to like 0.5, or midtones down to 0.3. Now we're only blurring those bits. Now we're just kind of creating the glowstone to glow. Let's maybe bring it up at 0.8. And you get a little glow on his hands too. And this gives us so much more control over how things glow. And if you want some more advanced boosh, what we normally do here at BPS is we take all of this, duplicate it, and just bring it kind of down below, and create a whole nother add. Let's duplicate that as well, and move the color corrector over there. And what we do is we take the same thing, we're going to set it up like so. So we have the mix coming out. The mix now goes into two different color correctors, which are basically the same, which each go into two blurs. Then first we're going to mix one in using add, and then we're going to mix the next one in using add. And if we follow this mix over, it simply goes to the top here, this add goes to the top here, which then goes to composite. However, with the bottom boosh, rather than changing it from like 20 and 20, which is a very tight boosh, let's click on this. We're going to make this blur something like 120. And by having these two different versions of the boosh, we get the little tight boosh, then we get this big, thick kind of boosh. And in this outdoor scene, it's not that useful because it's just a kind of bright and crazy scene. But in just a moment, I'll be showing you why having that multi-control is very handy. So that pretty much covers all the things I'm actually going to be teaching you in this tutorial. And the rest of this episode, because that was a little shorter than some of the other episodes, I wanted to actually start looking at some of the previous BPS animations, as well as just kind of playing around with some different lighting. I'm not sure that this isn't the way I normally do tutorials, however I thought maybe just kind of try something different. You let me know if you enjoy this. You might kind of find this more actually educational because I'll be showing you actual animations that we've created in the past. First, let's just save off the scene how it is. And before we even get into the other ones, let me just kind of do a few examples of some different stuff we can do in this scene. Right now we use the default blue sky, but honestly that actually allows kind of the least amount of control over interesting skies. If we pick something like one of these bright red skies, and then we let's change the sun from something like, a value of 3 to something like, 6, and make it a little more red. And now let's go back into our F11, and it looks like we didn't save off the thing with the boosh, but whatever. Let's go into slot 7, and we'll render it here. And as you can see, by doing that, we have a very different kind of mood now. Here's the before. Different sky, different sun color. That already has made a pretty big difference. However, every time you kind of change the sky and sun color, you probably also want to change the mist color, maybe because it's kind of orange sky, maybe give it an orangey mist. That looked a lot better already. Let's kind of maybe bring it up a tiny bit, make it kind of misty. The other thing to note is now that we added our boosh, one thing we can do is change this mix to something like add, whereas before we didn't notice too much. However, now when we have it set to add, because we have these booshes glowing, let's decrease the tight boosh. I notice on his arms there's a lot of kind of glowing on his arms. Let's decrease that tight boosh, and we can increase this overall glowy boosh. We can get some really kind of pretty glowing kind of, shine coming over everything. This is obviously a little too much, but I'm just showing you if you want some kind of moody atmospheric lighting, you can do something like this. Let's bring this even up to like max just to see what happens. So you can get all kinds of crazy stuff. You can play with colors, get some really interesting lighting. One of the other things you'll note is that whenever you add a lot of kind of cinematic lighting, we'll probably want to, for some reason that didn't save all those settings. Let me re-render that. So here's kind of the crazy lighting, and like I was about to say, it was if we turn down the ambient occlusion. Right now we have it 0.4. That's good for like daytime things. But if we're going to be doing some cool cinematic lighting, we want things to be kind of contrasty. If we turn that down to like 0.1, now we'll get much more of a kind of contrasted scene. And if we compare back to kind of where we started, Here is our original. Everything was awful. Added some ambient occlusion. Added some sunlight. You know, and that's where most people tend to stop. Or even before that. Hopefully not. But that's usually where people stop. However, we went the extra distance. We made the leaves a little nicer looking. Which you don't have to, but you can. We added translucency. And the translucency didn't do much here. However, once we started, you know, adding some mist and glow, now is where you start seeing translucency. Here's where I decrease the ambient occlusion some more. Let's actually kind of get like a different angle. Let's look towards the sun, just so you can get kind of an idea of what it looks like looking into the grass towards the sun. Here we have some pretty cool cinematic atmospheric lighting. And again, we have these two bushes. The reason we call them bush is because if you kind of add them on one at a time, you have like, okay, here's how the scene looks. You know, okay, that's cool, I guess. But once you add the first one, it's like, boosh. You get this cool kind of glowing effect. And you add the second one, you get this big glowing effect. And you can, you know, really make it crazy if you want. You can get some really pretty lightings just by doing something like this. But let's start moving into the other scenes. I'm not going to save this off now because we'll want to kind of go back. Actually, I might save this off. This is honestly kind of pretty. Maybe we'll keep the lighting like this. Because I kind of like this. Maybe I'll adjust this a little bit more, and next episode we'll start with something a little more interesting. So let's save this, and let's start looking around. So here is the scene for Don't Touch, and we're not going to be getting into all the other stuff about the animation parts of it. I've done a lot of other things, but what we want to be looking at is the lighting, because this is a kind of more of an interior cavern. We only really have, you know, one little hole up here and one hole over here. So what we want to do is see how we kind of set all this light up. And as we start flying around, already we'll see a bunch of different lights. If I click on some of these, we'll see what I did was I added a spotlight, which we haven't even looked at yet. And basically what that does is, if you create Shift-A, lamp, spotlight, you'll get a spotlight. And what I like to do when first setting them up, if you click on Show Cone under the spotlight settings up here, you can actually see that, oh, okay, it's literally a spotlight. And what I did, I actually added a few of them, kind of shining down onto the lever, because what I wanted to do is I wanted the lever to be illuminated. We want to actually see the lever, and, you know, we want it to kind of stand out and look better. So I put a few of these around here just to kind of create some light there. I also have a sun lamp, which is shining in through the cave to kind of illuminate these whatchamacallits, all these little leaves and vines. Also, one thing to notice is you'll see right here, I have a very small area light, which is basically just like a little small square that you can't really see, but it shines light. And the reason that is here is because in a lot of shots, you'll see that I want a little bit more light on his face, because if the sun was simply coming from, you know, behind him back here, his face is going to be pretty dark. So I have a very dim light here that just kind of shines a little more light onto his face. And as you see, as he starts moving, it moves along with him to keep the light on him. And it's just kind of important to mention that, you know, you don't have to just set up the light for an animation and just say, okay, we're good, let's go with it. It's important to know in the next episode when we start looking at animation, you can, of course, animate the lights as well to kind of follow the characters. But let's get a good shot of the scene, and I'm going to start one by one deleting some of the lights, and we'll see the difference all these lights made. So let's go into slot 1, and I'm going to turn the samples actually down just so I'm not kind of waiting here all day. And we'll start going through and dissecting the lighting for the scene. So here's the default lighting. As you can see, this is one of the animations I was most happy with, the outturn of the lighting. And here is how we have it by default. Let's go into slot 1, and let's just get rid of those spotlights just so I can really show you what difference adding just a few spotlights on something that you want to illuminate makes. Let's delete, I think I have 3 of them. Let's delete them and we will re-render into slot 2. So here, without those spotlights, we can see the little lever doesn't stand out nearly as much as when we added those light. It really kind of drew the viewer's eye towards that lever, whereas taking that off, we don't really even see it. It just kind of blends in the background. So adding extra light can really help, you know, move your eye into different things. If we look at the ambient occlusion, I believe it is currently set to, yes, 0.3, and there's our, distance of 4. I like that distance for some reason. Ambient occlusion, 0.3, a little bit less than outdoor scenes. The distance of the mist, you'll notice I actually keyframed, which is stuff in animation. For example, in this opening shot, I wanted the mist to extend all the way back to the distant trees. However, inside the cave, when the camera moves into the cave in a moment, I wanted the mist to kind of stop in the distant cave. That way we'd see him kind of, you know, in the mist up here. If we look at the compositing, I believe you're going to be recognizing most of it. We have the render layers. It goes into the mist, which we have adding. We added, and again, actually, if you click these little arrows, you can minimize things. So as you can see, I minimized the blur and the color correction. You'll recognize most of these are pretty much the same settings that we normally use. So we got the two adds, but that's the lighting. We only have pretty much those lights I showed you. I think I also have, yeah, right here I have another area lamp that kind of follows him around. As you can see, in different shots, I moved it whether to be on his face or to be shining, you know, at the sign to light up different things. But that's kind of covers it for the for Don't Touch. Let's look at another scene. Here's Galaxy Wars Part 4, which even though it was animated by ROA Nitrox, I was actually the one who helped kind of with the compositing and lighting of it. We actually went back through and made things a little more kind of contrasty and glowy. So if I render this out, we'll see here is that we have a kind of different scenario because while that's rendering, go back in the 3D viewport, while that's going, you'll see that there's not really any spot for the sky to come in. So if we were to add a sunlight, all of the sunlight would be blocked by the roof. So we couldn't use sunlighting, which made it a little more difficult. What we did, we have the ambient occlusion set to 0.2, which is pretty low. The distance, however, is set pretty high because we want a lot of kind of dark shadows in the distance. And if we go back to what's rendering, we'll see that created for a very pretty dark kind of scene. Whereas here we have these blocks set to being pretty bright. And if we look in the compositing, we'll see, yeah, and again, we see we have a little bit of mist, not much. If we go into the compositing, a lot of the lighting is kind of in the compositing. We'll see we got just a very tiny bit of mist, less than 0.1. We turn it way up just to kind of see what it's potentially doing. We'll see, we could have made it really misty and very kind of humid in there, but we wanted it kind of subtle. We wanted that kind of dark feel. So here we go. Here we have the scene with some lightsabers. And as you can see in the compositing, if you go back to the first, here's how things are initially, which things, just like they're holding little sticks. And as you can see, we go boosh, and we get a cool little nice tight glow. We add a big boosh for a kind of thick glow. And using both of those together really creates this nice kind of feel to it. And finally, I'll be looking at Blocking Dead, because Blocking Dead was a little more of a dark scene. I figured it'd be interesting just to kind of show what a kind of dark outdoor scene looked like. And here, if we go to the world settings, we have the ambient occlusion a lot lower. We had a 0.26, distance at 5. However, one thing you'll notice is I actually had the ambient occlusion creating a lot of light, and we actually kind of decreased the light using color correction. Also, one thing you'll notice is I have the strength of the sky set a little bit less than 1 because I wanted the sky to be a little darker. So let's just kind of render out what we have so far in slot 1. So as it's rendering, you can see it's actually quite bright in the scene. We simply use kind of color correction to make it look a little darker. Let's go into the compositor and let's kind of look through all these things. I'm just going to make the screen a little bigger. We start from the beginning. We have our nice kind of bright daytime scene. I'll show you the light setup in a little bit. We added the the mist, which takes us from, here's default, and here we just want some simple mix. We just want the distance to feel very foggy. Then I don't even know what this is. Oh, I desaturated a little bit. You can add different nodes in here. Here's where I did the color correction. This is what made it look a lot darker. Here's like the default with the mist. Here's where it's starting to look a little more like Blocking Dead. I added the tight boosh on the, actually I think that's the wide boosh. There's the big boosh, and there's the tight boosh. Then we added a vignette, kind of soft vignette, which again, if you want to know how to do it, that's how to do it. I'm not really going to go into it. You don't really need to do those. And then the motion blur, which we don't need to know about. But there you can see the progression from blah all the way to ta-da. And all of that is done in the compositor. Every single thing you see here, if you even with nicest lighting, if you render it, it's going to look like that. However, good compositing brings you from that to something that looks like this, which is a completely different mood and feel. It almost feels like this is unrendered and this is rendered. It's a very different atmosphere just by doing that. So let's look at the lights. I believe there's just one sunlight. Yeah, here it is. Here's the sunlight, which is actually the moonlight. So it's actually, so yeah, again, see how it's blue here. Earlier I mentioned about how the sun can either be kind of orange or blue. Here's a kind of blue moonlight. It's very not bright. It's only set to 1.5. I think I had some lights. Yeah, every so often I put a spotlight directly under these lamps to simulate the street lamp glowing down here. For me, lighting honestly is one of my favorite parts. Setting up all the lighting at the beginning is just a lot of fun. There's so much cool stuff you can do with it. Which is why I wanted to kind of cover it before we even got into animation. But that is actually about it now. You should have most everything you know to add lights to your scene, to put lights in your scene. If you're noticing everything is really noisy, all you really need to do is go under your, oops, let me go back to this. Under your samples render, just increase that number a bunch to get rid of some of the noise. As long as you have everything else set up most the same way, you should be pretty good with noise though. Next episode, we'll be finally looking at animation. I know it's an animation tutorial, and so far we haven't even started animating, but all these other things are really important to get set up first. That way, you know them, you have the lighting good, you can start rendering things. If you want to kind of take a render of your scene and show it to your friends, you can do that now. And what's actually interesting is this is almost where you can stop if you don't want to do animation. If you just want to create like YouTube banners or renders of your friend, you can actually kind of stop right here. All you really need to learn how to do is to pose the character now. You don't need to know anything about the animation parts. However, next episode we'll be covering animation. And until then, I'm Arbor617 from Black Mojo Studios, and I'll see you next episode. Thanks everyone for watching. If you've been enjoying this tutorial series, please be sure to check out our Patreon. You can support us financially as low as only $1 a month, and you can get cool rewards such as seeing all of our animations early, having your name in the credits, or even having your skin in the animations. The link is in the description, as well as on the screen.